Hey friends, it's Gloria and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be doing a mashup of reading stats from 2021 as well as a reading survey. I was inspired by Kayla from Books and Lala as well as from Roshan's reading channel. They both did a combination of reading stats and the reading survey, which is just a list of questions originally from a blog, I believe. I will list the questions down below. But first, I'm going to be going through my reading stats, some highlights of the year. I love these videos. I keep track of my reading through Goodreads, through Storygraph, as well as through an Excel spreadsheet from Hardback Hoarder. I will also link that down below. I have loved using that spreadsheet. I don't use everything that spreadsheet entails, but it helps pull some of these stats as well. And so I will be looking at my computer and inserting the graph or whatever here to the side, and then we'll get into the questions, which are more like superlatives, in the second half of the video. So let's just jump into it. In total, I read 200 books. I was in the 190s in December and then realized if I'm ever going to get to 200, it's going to be in 2021. So I really pushed myself and read 13 books in 13 days. In December, you can go watch that vlog where I tried to achieve that number and I made it. It's kind of an insane number. I think the previous year was 71 books. And in general, one of my main reading goals is to slow it down, take it back a notch, read bigger books, spend more time in a book or within a series perhaps, and try to just like consume less. But we'll see if that happens. So 200 books read, 9 DNFs, which I don't count towards my book read goals, but I do count the amount of pages that I read in that book, even though I DNF'd it, not the whole book, but whatever amount I got to. And in total, I read somewhere between 60,000 and 63,000 pages. The majority of books though, I listened to as an audiobook, so I didn't actually physically read 63,000 pages. For 2022, I will be trying to track just the physical pages that I'm actually reading and just the audiobook hours that I'm actually reading, so I have an actual kind of number of the two. Speaking of, I listened to 1,001 hours of audiobooks, which equates to about 42 days in total. And I don't count the full length of the audiobook, but just the amount I listened to. So in Libby, which is where I primarily listen to my audiobooks, when you're done, you can click on Reading Journey and it tells you how long you listened to it. And that number is usually different from the timestamp of the actual audiobook because I listen to usually on 1.5 speed to 1.75 speed, sometimes 2 times speed. So in general, my time listening is shorter than the actual audiobook length. So I count that shorter length, not the full audiobook length. So 1,001 hours, still nuts. So looking at the breakdown, 54.5% were audiobooks, 44% were physical reads, and 1.4 were ebooks. I read like a couple ebooks, but I don't have like a Kindle reader. Those were just on my phone. So yeah, majority are audiobooks. Don't have a problem with that. I sometimes pair an audiobook with the physical book, but in general, I do a lot of my reading while I'm on the go, while I'm doing errands, while I'm puzzling. I love audiobooks. They're my favorite way to read. They are what got me back into reading and excited about reading. So I have no shame that I listen to so many audiobooks. I do want to read more physical books though in 2022. Next, looking at intended audience, 75.6% were adult books, 13.9% were middle grade, and 9.6% were YA. No surprise, I read majority of adult books, and middle grade, most of those were classics, and YA I dabbled here and there. Looking at the content and genre breakdown, 61% of my reading was fiction and 39% was nonfiction. Pretty happy with that, basically 60-40. I ideally would love to get to 50-50 because I love reading nonfiction and I have such amazing reading experiences with nonfiction. A lot of 5-star books are nonfiction. So if I want to read higher quality books and have a higher average rating, which we'll get to in a second, I should be reading more nonfiction. It's not like a hard goal. I'm not like gonna keep myself really to it to get to 50-50. I'm fine with 60-40 as well, but maybe a little bit closer to 50-50 would be nice for 2022. Looking at the other genres as a whole though, I mean, no surprise, nonfiction, one of my biggest chunks, historical fiction, and actually classics made it quite high in my pie chart, but then in Storygraph, it's weird that it counts young adult as a genre. I wouldn't count young adult as a genre, that's just the audience. So that's kind of a strange one to look at. Memoir makes sense, history makes sense, comics. I did read quite a few graphic novels, classics, mystery, children's, horror, which is funny, we'll get to in a second. I don't actually read horror books, but I did read the Walking Dead series, which are horror books, so that's why that one is high. In terms of pacing, I like that Storygraph kind of tells you this as well. 53% of my reading was medium paced, 25% was fast, and 22% was slow. In general, I love to read fast-paced books, so I'm surprised it's not a little higher, but historical tends to be either medium or slow, and nonfiction is usually medium. Like, you can't really have a super fast-paced nonfiction book, I think. So it makes sense that medium is the majority of my reading. In terms of page number breakdown, 59% were less than 300 pages and 40% were 300 to 499 and 1% was 500 plus. The thing with Storygraph though, and this breakdown, is Storygraph does not count audiobooks in the page number count. And so actually a lot of my lengthier books that were over 500 pages I listen to as audiobooks, but they don't count in the 500 plus page count because I listened to them as an audiobook. So this is a little bit skewed. Another graph and pie chart that's fun in Storygraph is moods. So it's saying here that the majority of my reading is emotional and reflective and informative. My least read genres are relaxing, funny, and hopeful. I mean, it makes sense. I don't read a lot of like humorous and super lighthearted books. I found this one kind of interesting too, looking at my most read authors. So the first 3 are all in the Walking Dead series. So I'll mention it in a bit too, but The Walking Dead is a graphic novel series that the show was based off of. I am a fan of the show. My husband and I watch it, and I decided to just binge the entire comic series. There were 16 separate bind-ups of all of the comics. They're technically all classified as like zombie apocalypse horror. So that's why horror was a larger chunk in my genre breakdown and why my most read authors are the creators of those comic series. But the other one coming up is Ellen Montgomery with 9 books, which makes sense because I read the entire Anne of Green Gables series in 2021. And then John Lewis, he wrote the March graphic novel trilogy as well as Run, and I read all 4 of those in 2021. So those are my most read authors. Not necessarily my most favorite at all, but I just read multiple of their books. Goodreads always shows you what your shortest and longest book is. So my shortest book was The Hill We Climb by Amanda Gorman. This is a poetry collection and it's only 32 pages long. It was the poem that she read during Joe Biden's presidential inauguration. And then Diana Gabaldon's Drums of Autumn, which is the 4th book in the Allender series, was my longest book with 880 pages, although I technically also listened to the audiobook of this. Another thing Goodreads likes to show is the most popular book, which was Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank, and almost 5 million people also shelved this book. I think either read it or shelved it as want to read. And then the least popular is Portland Memories. That was a photographic like coffee table book about Portland history. It was actually really cool, like a really fun book. I was borrowing it. My highest rated book on Goodreads, which I will also talk about later, is The Only Plane in the Sky, An Oral History of 9/11 by Garrett M. Graff, coming in at 4.72 stars on average, which is pretty highly rated, and it makes sense because that book was amazing. So speaking of star ratings, let's look at my star rating breakdown. So Goodreads only lets you do whole stars. My Excel sheet, I can only do half stars and full stars. And then Storygraph has 0.25 breakdowns. And so looking at that, my average rating on Storygraph is 3.53, whereas on Goodreads it's 3.6. And this is what my rating pie chart looks like on my Excel sheet. So in general, from looking at this, the majority of my reads were 4 stars. And then my second highest was 3 stars and 3.5 falls in the middle. I still view this as a very positive reading experience because if you're looking at the majority of my reading from 3 to 5 stars, and 3 I still consider a good book. I still liked it overall. I would love to get that average rating higher though, and I think my plan with reading more nonfiction is the way to go to bump it up to higher. And I'm getting more particular in what I'm reading, so I'm hoping for a higher average rating at the end of 2022. I think I can do it. And then finally, the last graph is the number of books and pages broken down by month. So I started off with the first 5 months reading pretty normal, average 10 books a month, 10 to 12, still pretty high. And then June, clearly I went crazy, and that was because I read 36 books in the month of June, but 16 of those were the Walking Dead graphic novel series, and those are really easy to read. But that just kind of kicked off my crazy amount of reading for the rest of the year and somehow how I got to 200 books. So yeah, those are some of my main stats looking through my reading as a whole. Now let's jump into the reading survey, which is just a series of questions that talk about different superlatives, least favorite, favorite, those kinds of things. So let's jump into that. And again, the questions are listed down below. The first question is favorite 2021 release. For these next questions that are going to ask favorite, etc., I have to pick a favorite fiction and nonfiction because I just can't choose between one or the other, and that's why I made separate videos, my favorite fiction reads as well as my favorite nonfiction reads. I'll link both of those down below if you're interested and haven't seen those, because I can't pick, so I will give one of each. So for my favorite 2021 fiction release, I will say that it is The Nature of Fragile Things by Susan Meissner. Set in 1906 in San Francisco during the crazy earthquake and then fire that happened, follows this young woman who answers to be a mail order bride for a man in San Francisco, and everything is not as it seems to be. This read a lot more like a mystery and like a survival story. My first exposure to this author, and it got me hooked. My favorite 2021 nonfiction release was American Baby by Gabrielle Glaser. This was an incredible look looking at the adoption industry in the US, particularly through the eyes of one family, and it also weaved in what was happening with culture at large in the US and what was changing and why certain things were happening in the adoption world. A lot of like shady stuff, underground stuff was happening. It was incredible. I learned so much. It was very eye-opening. The next question is, what was your favorite older release that you read in 2021? So for fiction, it's going to be Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. I read this classic in December and it was incredible. You can watch those videos if you haven't heard my thoughts on it already, but I absolutely fell in love with this family and with the characters. For my favorite older nonfiction read, it's got to be The Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom. This is actually the 35th anniversary edition, so this book was released a while ago, and this was an incredible book about Corrie ten Boom's experience living through the Holocaust, and it was wild and so eye-opening and amazing and encouraging, and she's just an incredible woman. The next question is a book that lived up to the hype. I couldn't pick just one, but I will mention both of these nonfictions, Know My Name by Chanel Miller and Just Mercy by Bryan Stevenson. These are all over the place. These are amazing books. Everyone talks about them. They're both really fantastic audiobooks as well, and they 100% live up to the hype. These were very important reads. They were incredibly eye-opening, also easy to read nonfiction. Like they weren't like a slog to get through or like really difficult to read in terms of how they were written. Two fantastic nonfictions. And then the fiction that lived up to the hype is Martian by Andy Weir. A lot of people love that book and it makes sense. I get it. It was fantastic. And the movie was also great. The next question is a book that didn't live up to the hype. You can go watch my least favorite reads video. I mentioned a lot of spicy takes in that, but the 3 books that did not live up to the hype: Tattooist of Auschwitz. I don't understand why that is such a popular historical fiction. It really was not well written at all. Like, I don't get it. And then the 2 really popular, but my unpopular opinion, is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue and Ready Player One. Both of those were no-goes for me. I don't get the hype. I don't understand, but I'll stop there. The next question is, what was your biggest reading accomplishment? I think for me, what I'm considering an accomplishment is reading Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. This was really one of my first classics that I've read in a very long time, and it was such an exciting and enjoyable read that it really opened up my eyes to reading more classics, which then led me to picking up and being more excited to pick up Little Women, which I loved. And then stepping into 2022, I have so many classics that I'm excited to read this year, and I'm just really enjoying them, looking forward to them. So I'm considering this an accomplishment because I think reading it was an accomplishment, and then it really made reading classics less intimidating than what I initially thought they would be like. The other big accomplishment is making my way through the Outlander series. I finished book 4. It is, I think, now a 9-book series, and I still have a long ways to go, but like I mentioned, this was my longest book. This was like a 40-something audiobook that I listened to, and it was a lot, but I'm still enjoying the series and continuing to read it. The next question is, what is your favorite character that you read? So I mentioned Little Women. I really loved all of these characters. It was really easy to root for them, to care about them. I loved Jo March, of course, and I loved Marmee, the mother figure in this book. This whole book was just so well written, so good. And then also I mentioned the Outlander series. Like, the main reason why I'm continuing to read this is because Claire and Jamie, the main characters, are so fun to root for. They're so well written. So even though the plot sometimes gets a little bit boring and you're a bit long, these books tend to be quite chunky, but the main reason why I'm still invested is because the characters are wonderful. They're really well developed, and I love a well-developed character. I mentioned earlier that I read through the Anne of Green Gables series, and although that's not an all-time favorite series because I found some of the middle books and latter books to be a little bit kind of boring and random, I still really liked Anne as a main character. I loved her whimsy and imagination and the way that she kind of took on the world. The next question is least favorite character. I mentioned this in my least favorite reads video, so without repeating myself, I'm just gonna give a general answer, and that is when serial killers are the main character, like the main point of view. So I really did not like They Never Learn, and I also DNF'd My Lovely Wife. What I'm realizing is I love to root for my character, I love to be invested in them, I want them to be overall good people. Serial killers inherently aren't good, even if the author's trying to spin them to say like, oh, they're good serial killers because they're only killing people who deserve it. You know, no, I'm not really into that, I think, anymore, as much as maybe I was when I was younger, because I liked shows like Dexter and stuff. But in general, when like serial killers are like the main character, not my vibe. The next question is, what was your like guilty pleasure read? And again, like I mentioned, it's got to be the Walking Dead series. I do not read horror books. I would say that's my least read genre, but for some reason the Walking Dead series is my exception to the rule. It is about like a zombie apocalypse and the world is ending, and it's super gory and super gruesome and very intense. There's also a lot of sex in there, a lot of language, like all the stuff that I don't usually read in books is in this series. But for some reason I read them all and I was like very into it. They weren't like favorite reads at all, but it was still really good, and I'm a big fan of the show, and my husband and I both watched the show, and so I really loved reading the original source material, which is so much better than the show, and actually seeing what the creators of this world intended for the characters to do and how it all wrapped up was very satisfying versus watching the show, which my husband and I are still watching. It's not very good anymore. But yeah, that's definitely my guilty pleasure. I don't know what it is about that graphic novel series, but I don't really see myself picking up more horror in the future. I think this is like my really one exception to the rule. But again, never say never, who knows? The next question is, what was your most like surprising read or surprising reading experience? And I think I'm just gonna answer this more generally again, and that is graphic novels. I really didn't know graphic novels, didn't really think about them or really know that they were a thing before booktube, before like regularly going to the library. My first, I think, graphic novel I picked up was the Anne of Green Gables graphic novel. I wanted to read it alongside reading the Anne of Green Gables actual book series, and I loved it. And then I discovered the graphic novel section in my library, and it opened up my world to graphic novels, and now I'm a big fan, and I will definitely be reading them in my life and continue reading them because I think that they're fantastic. And then my little niche I found is nonfiction graphic novels. I think are really fun and interesting reading experiences. So I really loved A Fire Story by Bryan. The author is a cartoonist, and so he not only wrote but also drew this entire book, and it was about him losing his home to a Northern California wildfire. And I also really loved A Faithful Spy by John Hendricks. This was a look at what was going on in Germany during World War II and Dietrich Bonhoeffer's life story and what was going on with him during World War II as well. Both of those fantastic graphic novels, and that was really surprising that I fell in love with graphic novels and has really changed my reading life now, so that's really cool. The next question is, what was your favorite writing of the year? I mentioned both of these already and I will mention them again. Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier and Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. I think these being classics and me being able to pick them up and read them and enjoy them so much shows how well that they were written and why they're classics and why they hold up now, even many years after they were originally created. The writing is beautiful. In this one, it's super atmospheric and gothic and such a unique reading experience. I really enjoy this one, and this one was just like so sweet, so wholesome, beautiful, like cozy vibes, well-written characters. And then since we're talking about writing, I will mention a collection of poetry because I don't write poetry and I don't know how anyone would ever, because it seems like very hard for me. I'm not a writer at all. So I really appreciated this poetry collection, All Along You Were Blooming by Morgan Harper Nichols. Just a beautiful collection of poetry on themes of love and grace and belonging, and it was just wonderful, so had to mention it. The next question is the book you push the most for people to read, and that has to be Dear Mrs. Bird by A.J. Pierce. I think, like I said, I don't think I made a single video without mentioning this book, but this one was just so good. It was a wonderful historical fiction set in London during the Blitz. Wonderful characters. It was kind of wholesome and light and tragic at the same time, funny and sweet, and just had all the right things mixed in. And I just couldn't shut up about this book for the last few months of the year since reading it. I had to mention it everywhere. The next question is, what was your favorite newly discovered author? And that has to be Susan Meissner as well as Amy Harmon. Both of these were 5-star reads, top historical fiction reads, and I am so excited to pick up more of these author books. It will happen in 2022. I'm picking up an Amy Harmon in February and a Susan Meissner at some point, but but I have more books of theirs on my shelves and I'm so eager to get to them because these were fantastic reading experiences and I'm looking forward to more from both of them. The next question is, what was your favorite cover? And that has to be The Four Winds by Kristen Hanna. The lighting's getting all dark now so you can't really see, but there's like, I guess you could kind of see there, gold foiling on here, and this is the UK edition of The Four Winds. I bought this off of Book Depository. This book was good for me. I liked it. It was a 3-star read. It wasn't my favorite read of the year at all, but I will be keeping it around because this cover is gorgeous. The next question is, a book that made you cry the most. That has to be The Only Plane in the Sky, An Oral History of 9/11 by Garrett M. Graff. I mentioned this book earlier, that it was the highest rated on Goodreads, and yeah, this book broke me. It was very informative and I learned so much about 9/11, but some of the things in this book, and rightly so, just completely broke my heart. It was so hard to read, so tragic to read. I think the point that really like I couldn't handle is the parts where you could hear, I listened to the audiobook as well as reading it physically paired together, and in the audiobook they actually put in the real recording of the flight attendants on the plane talking to like the flight people and basically saying like, my plane is hijacked, and you just hear the flight attendant's voice and just her saying that like people are stabbed and the plane is hijacked. Like, it was wild, and just reading that I was like, oh my goodness, I can't handle it. Like, it was really tough. And then the other section that just broke my heart was reading when people were jumping out of the buildings, out of the Twin Towers, and falling to their deaths, and like what that was like to other people around. And it was just very hard to listen to. It just burning, just emotional thinking about it. It was really tough. An incredible book, but very, very tough to listen to. And yeah, just it will easily make you cry because it's a very tough subject matter. All right, something a little bit more lighthearted. The book that made you laugh the most. Now, if you recall in my moods thing on Storygraph, funny was one of my least read moods. I don't read a lot of like humorous books, comedy books, lighthearted books, but the most like lighthearted that I can think of is Dear Mrs. Bird by A.J. Pierce. This book had some really sad parts too, but it also had some light parts and some sweet parts and funny parts. The other book that I really loved the humor in that I mentioned already is The Martian. Mark Watney's a really humorous and clever character. He made really funny jokes and he's very witty, and so I loved reading that book, and it did make me laugh quite a bit. And because laughter has to do with like entertainment, I will also say Will by Will Smith was one of the more entertaining nonfiction books that I read. He is an entertainer, so it made sense, but he definitely had some parts in the book that also made me smile and laugh and like get to know him more. So that was a really fun listening experience too. Great audiobook. So that's that. It is now dark outside and I'm losing natural light, but I really appreciate you guys sticking around for this long video. All of my 2021 wrapped up in a nice little bow. I don't think I have any more 2021 content. It was a great reading year. I'm glad to wrap it up and move forward with 2022 reading. Again, thank you so much for sticking around, for commenting, for all of the things, for subscribing. I know I just hit 1,000 recently. A Q&A video is coming up soon. If you haven't submitted a question yet, please do. But thank you so much for sticking around, and I will see you guys in another video soon. Bye!